The three issues that we really want to focus on with you today are, one is around the Bridge Act, which you've already heard of. Another is around the use of detention and deportation. And the third is really with regards to accountability and oversight of Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, so CBP and ICE. So we'll go into each one of those. Yeah, great. So we'll start with the Bridge Act, and I want to give just a little bit of background before we talk about the legislation itself and what it would do. So as many of you know, there are approximately 11 million undocumented individuals and undocumented immigrants in the United States, and there are many injustices that this group of people face. Among them, of course, are access to employment, access to services and resources, such as to be able to attend schools, for example, also workplace violations of rights, etc. We could go on. Of those approximately 11 million, about 1.8 million are what we call dreamers, or young people who came to the United States as children, who know the U.S. as their home, who lack legal status. And they're known as dreamers, as many of us know, because of some legislation that was introduced and reintroduced, and unfortunately has not passed Congress, that would have provided a pathway to citizenship for those young people who study, who serve in the military. And so, as I've mentioned, this piece of legislation, the DREAM Act, has failed to pass on multiple occasions. And so in 2012, then President Obama ordered the creation of the DACA program, or the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, and that was to benefit those individuals who would have benefited from the DREAM Act. So what DACA does, the creation of DACA did, and what DACA currently does as a program, is provide temporary relief from deportation, and it also provides employment authorization for those who meet certain criteria, who pay an established fee, and who also have to pass a background check, among other criteria. And so there are more than 750,000 young people who have received and benefited from DACA, and I want to, of course, make note that within our own Jesuit network, there are some really wonderful DACA recipients and folks who have, I think, seen the benefit of this program and who would benefit from these types of legislation. Just last Thursday, we had the privilege of working with ISN, the Nation Solidarity Network, and here at the Jesuit Conference to organize and put on a briefing with elected officials' offices, so staff that work with those in Congress, to present on the Hill, and Myra from Loyola University in Chicago shared her story as a DACA recipient, an undocumented individual, of some of the challenges that come with the lack of legal status, and the importance of us continuing to work towards immigration reform. So it's with her in mind, and many others within our network, but also around our country, that we're mindful of these programs and these pieces of legislation. I want to note that President Trump, leading up to his inauguration in the first few weeks of his administration, has threatened to repeal DACA, but it's important to note that has not happened, or at least it hasn't happened yet. That said, we continue to be certainly concerned with the situation of all undocumented individuals, and especially of these individuals. So I want to talk a little bit about a piece of legislation that was initially introduced in December of 2016 and was reintroduced in both the House and the Senate in the 115th Congress, which is the Congress that we're in right now. And the piece of legislation is called the Bridge Act, and it stands for Bar Removal of Individuals Who Dream and Grow Our Economy. And so basically what this legislation would do is to provide what is called provisional protected presence and employment authorization to those individuals who are eligible for DACA. And so it ensures that they can continue to work and to study and to be protected from deportation while Congress debates and looks for a longer term and more comprehensive solution to our broken system. And would note that that protection has a duration of 3 years from the date of enactment of the bill of legislation. It would benefit those who currently have DACA, those whose DACA expires. They could apply for the provisional protected presence, and those who don't currently have DACA also, but are DACA eligible, would also be able to apply for it. And so there's a couple of things that I want to note about the Bridge Act. The one that I've already mentioned, which is that this is really a temporary solution, right? So we know that really what we're seeing at present is the failure of a larger system. There's structural challenges with the immigration system that we have, and it really requires a much more comprehensive response and a much more compassionate response. But this is one small step, but it's a step in the right direction towards fuller participation from those dreamers among us. The other thing I want to note is that this is a piece of legislation that has bipartisan support, and that the original sponsors have intended it in that way. And so right now in the Senate there are 8 co-sponsors, and in the House there are 17 co-sponsors, and they're even with Democratic and Republican support, and that's very intentional. And so we want to continue to, and I think this might be the next slide, or I'm sorry that I can't see it, but we want to continue to encourage our elected officials to take leadership on this issue and to co-sponsor if they haven't already. So basically what we would ask you to do is check if your senator and your representative are already co-sponsors. If they do, please be sure to thank them. That's very important. Can't emphasize that enough. If they're not already co-sponsors, then please urge them to become co-sponsors of this piece of legislation so that it can move forward. And why don't I pause there and see if there are questions on that piece on the Bridge Act?
Kristen, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's possible that there are many Democrats that could be supporting the Bridge Act that are not co-sponsors right now, and this is because of that kind of member-to-member sponsorship style that's going on. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. So the original co-sponsors of the legislation have decided, they've heard expressions of support among numerous Democrats, and they have actually held off on making them official co-sponsors until there is a Republican to also become included as a co-sponsor and demonstrate that bipartisan support. So for those of you that live in states and districts where you have Republican elected officials, it's especially important that you reach out to them and either thank them or encourage them to also become co-sponsors.
Great. Kristen, there was a question. It was posed in terms of collaboration going on right now with United Dream supporters related to the Bridge Act.
On their website.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say it's been limited. There has been some collaboration and coordination in efforts of broader coalitions, but it hasn't been as close as it could be. And I'd be curious to hear if there's a particular interest from the person who asked that question about collaboration and coordination with United We Dream. Moving into detention and deportation, the first thing that I want to note with a little bit of background is that the use of detention and deportation are not new. As we know, last year we saw record levels of detention. We concluded 2016 with over 40,000 people detained. During the Obama administration, 2.5 million immigrants were deported. So these are not new tools or new tactics, right? And from those experiences, we have seen that part of what comes with detention and deportation are some really negative impacts, including family separation, psychological, emotional impacts, both for those that are detained as well as for family members, and then also access to protections for asylum seekers, for those that come seeking asylum. And I wanted to, if I can find it here, just share with you briefly about a story about the impacts, the psychosocial impacts of detention and deportation. And this comes from a report before the Inter-American Human Rights Court, in which Boston College was involved. And it says, Julia, a Guatemalan indigenous Mayan woman, was detained in a raid at a Massachusetts factory where she was manufacturing backpacks for US soldiers in Iraq. Julia's 2-year-old son was with a babysitter when his mother was detained. He was waiting by the windowsill, as was his habit, for his mother on the day she did not return from work. Julia was transported to a Texas detention center. She was prohibited from placing a phone call to her family for the first few days there. She pleaded with immigration officials. Her son had asthma, a condition for which he had previously been hospitalized, and the babysitter didn't know how to operate his oxygen machine. Julia recalled that she was threatened by immigration officials that her children would be taken from her if she continued to ask for quote-unquote special treatment, and was informed that her processing could take anywhere from 1 month to 1 year to complete. Julia was separated from her son for 9 days during her detention. According to Julia, the raid and resulting separation precipitated her son's tantrums and nightmares, difficulty sleeping, eating, and speaking, and extreme separation anxiety. So, this is one story that I wanted to share just because it gives some of the specifics of what this actually looks like for families that are separated through detention and deportation. In this case, it was a 9-day separation, but we know that these separations can really vary, and some of them are longer term when they result in deportation. So, and that story I would notice was from 2013. So, so again, these are not new approaches. We can learn from them and some of the negative impacts that we have already seen as we move forward, and as we hear that these approaches will not only be continued, but that the current administration is really looking to increase them and expand them significantly. So let me talk a little bit about the policy side at present, and the 2 recent executive orders from President Trump, as well as some memos that were released from the Department of Homeland Security, Secretary Kelly, regarding the implementation of those memos, of the implementation of the orders. So the orders were regarding border security and interior enforcement, and they were released at the end of January, as you might recall. Some of the components that these orders include are an increase in the use of detention, significantly expanding who would be so-called priorities, or who would be targeted for detention and deportation. A limited use of prosecutorial discretion, I'll talk a little bit more about that. An increase in the use of expedited removal. And another piece that's in there is the return of non-citizens to contiguous territories. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So just to highlight a bit some of our concerns around these components and really what they could mean, and that we already are starting to see some of the meaning behind them. On the use of detention, we know that it is costly to detain people, but as the story that I shared really demonstrates, and I think more importantly, the psychological and emotional toll that it has on people is really quite great. And I see somebody shared the report. Thank you for doing that. And concerning. So we're concerned about those impacts. We're concerned about the separation of families. And in particular, when we have seen that there are alternatives to detention that can be just as effective and that are less traumatizing, that where we can avoid some of these adverse impacts. In terms of expanding those who can be detained and deported, one of the things that the executive order mentions is that it includes those who not only have been convicted of a crime, but also can include those who have been charged or those who are deemed a threat to public safety or to national security. So we're concerned by this in conjunction with the limitation of prosecutorial discretion, which prosecutorial discretion basically means that DHS has the authority to determine the extent to which they will enforce immigration laws, and that has been in place as a way of helping DHS to use its limited resources and limited time more effectively. And so under the Obama administration, there were certain priorities for immigration enforcement to make more effective use of those resources. So these orders really limit the use of that, and we're concerned that by expanding so far those who will be targeted for deportation and detention, and by not exercising this prosecutorial discretion, that people can be targeted for very, very minor crimes, and sometimes that crime might just be having immigrated. So I think we're already starting to see this. A few weeks ago, was in February, you may have seen that Kino Border Initiative received a woman by the name of Guadalupe Garcia de Barrios. She and her family lived in Arizona, and Guadalupe was arrested in Phoenix when she went to her semi-annual check-in to request permission to remain in the U.S. With ICE in Phoenix. And so this is an example of a woman who previously would have been able to stay in the U.S., was deported to Nogales, and it demonstrates the family separation that we can see. She has 2 U.S. citizen children who remain in Arizona, and this deportation has impacts for Guadalupe and of course for her family as well. Want to mention that, and then another component of these orders and of the memos regarding their implementation is the expanded use of expedited removals. So this basically says that individuals can be removed without going before an immigration judge or having an immigration hearing. And instead, it basically gives that power of determination on deportation to ICE officers. So previously, this was the case. This was in effect within 100 miles of a U.S. border, and for those individuals within 2 weeks of arrival. And now it's been significantly expanded to geographically to anywhere in the United States, and to 2 years versus 2 weeks. And so those individuals have to in some way be able to prove that they've had continuous presence within the United States for those 2 years. So again, this is something where we can learn from policy that has already been in place and that has had adverse effects. We already have been concerned that there are people fleeing violence who have been wrongfully detained with expedited removals and who haven't had due process and fair consideration of asylum claims because they haven't had the necessary the time to put together the necessary legal evidence and to access legal counsel. But we're concerned that with this vast expansion, that it will increase the vulnerability of many more people, and that it will also affect people who are not new arrivals, who are actually integrated into our communities. Chris, how are we doing on time?
We're doing okay.
Shall we move forward?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so sorry, I just want to add one last point on that, which is that although we are focusing on some of the impacts of detention and deportation here in the U.S., I want to note that when these individuals are returned to home countries, and some of them for example, to Central America, Mexico, and places that are struggling with levels of violence right now, that further complicates the situation, and that in the long run, it may not be helping us to, of course it's not helping to return individuals to violent situations, where those situations will become further complex and we'll have more and more people fleeing situations of violence. So in terms of the asks that we would encourage you to put out there and contact your elected officials on, really the main ask is oppose the detrimental effects of detention and deportation on families and communities, all those effects that we've just talked about. So specifically what that looks like is opposing the expansion of these expedited removals. As we've already talked about, it can sometimes lead to the wrongful deportation of people fleeing violence. And we're concerned about this expansion and the impact that it will have, particularly on individuals who may be well established and contributing to our contributing members of our communities. Secondly, we ask that Congress not approve additional funding to expand detention bed space, but rather invest in alternatives to detention. So again, here we know about the toll psychologically, emotionally, that detention can have on people, and we want to avoid that and instead use more cost-effective and healthier alternatives to detention that are community-based. And yeah, we'll leave that there. And then finally, we want to ask that family unity be respected and preserved as ICE determines whether to deport or detain. So this is the story of Guadalupe, right? Strengthening the family is a core value of our faith, and parents shouldn't be torn away from their U.S. citizen children. Similarly, Central American minors shouldn't be discouraged from staying with their parents in the U.S. as they seek asylum. This is a component that we didn't speak quite as much about, but that was also included in the guidance for the executive orders in terms of unaccompanied minors only being considered unaccompanied minors for up till a certain point in their case. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions.
One question was related to best practices for those who are undocumented and have been in the U.S. more than 2 years to be able to demonstrate their continuous present to enforcement agents. So how would that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would really suggest contacting an immigration legal a professional, either attorney or accredited representative on it for the legal advice portion of it. But, and they really, I think, based on their experience of trying to help individuals access immigration benefits, are experts in creativity and coming up with ways to demonstrate this. Sometimes it's through bills or leases. There's a variety of different types of documentation that can be used in immigration cases. And so they really would be able to provide the best guidance on that.
Great. And another question was from Mary Beth. She asked, for those of us who work with corporations, do you have any ideas on how U.S. corporations can be engaged to stand in solidarity with immigrants or with those they employ? Are there ways they can resist raids or take other steps to support their employees who are immigrants in the face of the executive orders?
That's a really good question. I think that we already are starting to see some of this through, for example, the Day Without Immigrants. We saw some, I know, here anyway, some employers who either closed or limited their hours because they wanted to show solidarity with their immigrant workers. In terms of resisting raids, I think that's a little bit more challenging. DHS issued some guidance in 2011 around certain sensitive locations where immigration enforcement agents shouldn't be entering except for in exceptional circumstances. Corporations and businesses aren't going to be among those. I think this is a really good question, and it's one that I would be happy to follow up on and see if there are other suggestions on ways that businesses can be in solidarity with their immigrant employees. So the last area that we wanted to spend a little bit of time with is CBP, or Customs and Border Protection, and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, oversight and accountability. So I want to speak just a little bit about some of the problems that we've seen, some of the concerns that we have already had, again, in recent years. This isn't a problem that has just emerged. We've seen increasing investment over the past several years in resources for immigration enforcement in the interior as well as along the border. And we are concerned about seeing a lack of accountability from those organizations, from those agents. In 2015, the Jesuit Conference, in partnership with Keno Border Initiative, published a report called Our Values on the Line, and it looked at some of the complaints and violations to migrant rights that were reported. That report notes that over 1 in 3 deported migrants report mistreatment or abuse by immigration officials. So that's an extremely high number of violations to migrant rights, and to concerns about mistreatment. Those complaints included things like verbal abuse, physical abuse, the separation of families, lack of medical attention, conditions in detention, not including belongings of migrants after custody. So these are violations to rights that we have been concerned about and that we continue to be concerned about. That report also found that the rapid hiring and inadequate screening and training, so laxed screening processes, were a really important contributing factor to the increase in those violations. And so we're concerned about this in this current context, because part of what the executive orders that were released in late January include is an increase by 10,000 ICE agents and by 5,000 CBP agents, Border Patrol agents specifically. So we're concerned that we might see the same pattern that we saw in fairly recent years with inadequate screening and training, and that will only result in violations of migrant rights. I also want to note that in recent years, Keno, as well as the Jesuit Conference, have worked on complaints of violations to migrant rights. And specifically, there are some mechanisms with the Department of Homeland Security where we can submit those complaints, provide information, details if the migrant is willing and interested in filing that complaint. And I would note that in our experience, the response to those complaints has been inadequate. It's been insufficient. So even on some very concerning complaints around, for example, physical abuse and the separation of families that puts members of the families in increased vulnerability. We've often received responses that there's insufficient information or that they're unable to substantiate the complaint. And so we're really concerned that would continue to be the case. And so really in this area, there are a few specific asks that we would make. One is to oppose lowering the hiring standards and to really request increased training for CBP and ICE agents. Here we've outlined what that might look like, making sure that agents are properly vetted, which would include mandatory pre-employment polygraph tests, as well as improved trainings that would include respect for human rights for migrants, and that should be based on real scenarios. So there are several organizations that work with immigrants and on immigration issues that have provided some of this feedback and suggestions on improved training, and we'd like to see those be put into practice. Secondly is to ensure that CBP and ICE agents are held to high standards of professionalism, and to do that by doubling the number of staff at the offices of professional responsibility. So we want to increase the number of staff, and that is to mandate that those offices investigate every complaint or allegation of corruption or of abuse. And then finally, to ensure that all migrants in detention have access to information on their rights and to how to complain about mistreatment. So right now we see that information is not always provided in the migrants' language of preference. They may not understand it. They may not have the necessary paperwork that they should be provided with in order to be able to express a concern or a complaint in that case. And so we want to be sure that they have the information that they need to be able to submit those complaints if relevant, if applicable, and if they're interested in doing so. Any questions on that piece?
Kristen, I think one of the pieces of the implementation documents of the executive orders, or the implementation memoranda that came out afterwards, talked about this influx in Customs and Border Patrol agents, and you referenced that in the talking points there. Is there anything else that you could share about the challenge of such a significant increase in the number of immigration law enforcement officials, and how will, just to understand, like, how will government pay for this? How will they manage such an increase? This seems like a significant number of staff that they would grow by.
Absolutely, and so we really shouldn't be seeing it very quickly if they're properly screening, vetting, and training all of those officials. But this is exactly why we're concerned. And I think we already are starting to see the impacts in the communities. Sometimes confusion between police and between ICE officials, and who is who. In some cases, collaboration and coordination and communication between local law enforcement and federal immigration attorneys. I'm sure many have seen the stories in the media that sometimes these are taking place, for example, outside of schools. Or a couple of weeks ago, we had a situation with ICE agents waiting outside of a church shelter in this part of the country outside of DC, and being detained upon leaving that shelter that the church held. So we're very concerned about that and how it encroaches on, for example, these directives around sensitive locations, the fear that it sows in communities. And on the budget side, I would say absolutely there exists some funding for DHS with which they can start to increase and expand these efforts and start to implement the executive orders. That said, they don't have sufficient resources to move forward with all of the different components that it entails. That will require further appropriations from Congress. And that really is our opportunity to speak, to ask our Congress not to fund this plan, and to instead fund policies, programs, services that will help to build our communities and families up.
Thanks, Kristen. And there was a question out there from the folks at St. Ignatius College Prep in San Francisco, who I know are excited to hear their name get called out. There they are. About what can Jesuit, communities do, whether it's maybe one individual or an institution like SI in San Francisco, a Jesuit parish, university, community, other concerned people connected to this network. Kristen, can you talk just a little bit about the impact of legislative advocacy of reaching out to your congressional representatives and the impact that can make, whether it be a letter, phone call, email, things like that, and maybe about, what you think might be the most valuable ways for people to do that outreach.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So first I would say there are so many things that you can do. The advocacy is one piece of that. There are also many pieces, many ways that you can be present within your own communities, showing solidarity, expressing solidarity with immigrants in your communities, with also in, for example, in detention centers, being visible, for example, holding vigils in your communities, for example. On the advocacy side of things, I would say pay attention both locally and federally. And I, at this point, can't thank you enough for your efforts at that federal level. I think, in our work here, really it is about the engagement of the broader network, because you, the voices from around this country, are what move the senators and the representatives that are here in DC. And without hearing your voice, they won't act. So that is why it's important that you both thank them when they do something that you're in support of, and also reach out to them and continue to push them on the asks that you have. We're in an interesting environment right now where, we talked a little bit on the Bridge Act about how there have been more Democratic co-sponsors so far than Republicans, and we've heard from a couple of Republican offices that they're, it's a hard time to be out there supporting these issues that they know are important. So when they do, it's extremely important that we thank them for their support across the board. That giving thanks and showing support, I think, is really crucial. And then in terms of the way in which we do advocacy, I would say if you can pick up the phone and call the office, that is wonderful. We, I think, have seen that has a greater impact than writing, although writing is also excellent. Please do write, but also call if you can. And the other thing I would encourage is a visit in district when your elected officials are on recess from here and they're back in their district, to develop that relationship and go back to them with the stories that you're seeing in your communities. Be sure that they're aware of them and what they look like in the areas where you live.
Thanks, Kristen. And the idea of IFAM really grew out of a desire not just to advocate legislatively at the federal or state level, but also to educate communities. That a form of advocacy is often helping people within our own communities to understand these issues with greater depth, to understand these issues from a human perspective. So there's a lot that can be done, whether it's sharing the story of an undocumented student who would benefit from legislation like the Bridge Act, or helping people to understand the impacts on families, immigrant families, that detention and deportation can have. Those can be really valuable, and not only for yourself, but also leading other people to potential advocacy engagement as well. And so that's a really important piece that could be on there. And we have some great resources on the IFAM website about the ways that your community can do some of that in community education. Kristen, there was a question, and I think this speaks to kind of the broader three issues of, legislation that is an alternative to some of the problems with the current trajectory that we're on with the new administration. Can you talk just a little bit about where we are in terms of, the administration, a Congress that is both houses are Republican, and just kind of some of the reality of what we'll see from legislation during this Congress on this issue? Just help us understand some of the landscapes, so maybe we can appreciate the type of legislation, how we might see positive things happen, in little pieces and bits here and there.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think it's constantly evolving. One of the pieces that I would point to is, I think that the budget is really an important piece of this. We have seen, particularly on the Republican side, concern around costs and expenditures. And at the same time, these executive orders to be carried out in there and fully will require significant funding. And so, that, for example, is where there is an argument around alternatives to detention for some, in addition to, of course, the concerns we have about the negative impacts of detention. There have been community-based programs that have been piloted that we can point to as an example of that. I would say also, in terms of the political climate and the context, at times I think we see openness to reform around immigration, and particularly for populations of Dreamers, but sometimes it comes at the expense of legislation or policies on the border, and that is something that we're concerned about. And so there's an interest in tightening or making sure we have what we call secure borders, and that we will look at using detention less, or we will consider a pathway to citizenship and legal status once the border is secure. And so we're concerned about that, and that largely because I don't think that they can be separated in that way, and because despite so much investment in border security over recent years, we haven't, I don't think, necessarily seen that we're safer, and we haven't seen that migrants are jeopardizing our public safety. So I think that responds some to your question.
Yeah. And again, we were joined today by Kristen Lionetti, who is the Policy Director at the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the United States. Kristen joined us from our office in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much, everyone, for being with us today, and have a great night.